Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richborn here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at this Canon RF 10-20mm f4L lens. This is the world's widest autofocus full-frame rectilinear lens. I'm going to talk about the body design and image quality, and when I was testing this lens, I found something that is very interesting that I think you really need to know before you buy this lens, so I'm going to share with you all this in this review as well. This Canon RF 10-20mm f4L is the latest ultra wide-angle zoom lens for Canon's full-frame mirrorless cameras. If you use it on an APS-C camera, then it will give you 16-32mm equivalent focal length, which is still pretty wide angle. This is the replacement lens for the DSLR EF 11-24mm f4L lens. Comparing these two lenses, the new lens loses a bit on the tail end, but it can go a little bit wider on the wide end, which makes this lens the world's widest rectilinear autofocus zoom lens. One huge difference between these two lenses is the size and the weight. This new RF lens is surprisingly small and light for a zoom lens that reaches 10mm, and it is also much lighter, about half the weight of the EF lens, even though they are both f4 lens. And remember, if you want to use the EF lens on your Canon mirrorless camera, you also have to add the adapter, which makes the whole combo even bigger and heavier. Even when I mount this lens on the Canon RP, which is already one of the smallest Canon R series full-frame camera, it still feels very well balanced and not front heavy at all. So if you want an ultra wide angle zoom lens, this RF 10-20 f4 is a really attractive choice, as the size and weight of this lens is just so much better than the old EF lens, and it can go even a little bit wider. And to give you a little bit better idea, the size of this RF 10-20mm lens is virtually the same size and weight of the Canon RF 14-35mm f4 lens, but the RF 10-20 is much wider in terms of field of view. The construction of this lens is great, like the usual Canon professional lenses, very solid, very high quality. The lens has a non-removable lens hood at the front. You cannot install any front filter because the lens doesn't have any front filter thread. But on the lens mount, there is a filter holder, so you can install gel filter there instead. There are 3 control rings on the lens. The front one is the custom control ring. Then we have the focus ring in the middle and the zoom ring near the lens mount. The overall length of the lens doesn't change when you adjust the zoom or focus, but the front element would move a little bit when you adjust the zoom ring. There are 2 switches on the side of the lens. One is the usual AF/MF switch, and the other one is for you to enable or disable the optical image stabilizer. Yes, the lens has built-in optical image stabilizer, and I will talk about that a bit more very soon. There is also a customizable button next to the switches. It is a weatherproof lens, as you would expect for a Canon L lens, and you can also see there's a rubber seal on the lens mount. Apart from not able to install a front filter, there is really nothing I can complain about the design or build quality of this lens. As I mentioned just before, this lens has the built-in optical image stabilizer, and Canon rated 5 stops with just the optical image stabilizer, or 6 stops when you pair this lens with a EOS R series camera that has IBIS. While it's true that in general, wide-angle lenses doesn't need stabilization as much as lenses that has a longer focal length, but I certainly won't complain when the manufacturer add the optical image stabilizer to the lens, especially if the size of the lens can still be kept at very compact size. This is a video I shot using this lens at 20mm with the Canon RP. I was walking normally and holding the camera with both hands. When the stabilization is turned off, the footage is quite shaky despite it is a pretty wide angle lens. But once I enable the stabilization removes a lot of the smaller vibration and jitter. So the footage is still a little bit shaky, to be honest, but it looks much more pleasant without those small jitters. I still see a bit of image warping at the corner sometimes, especially when I'm shooting at the wide end. Now remember, I'm testing this with a camera that doesn't have IBIS. If you use this lens with a camera that has IBIS, then the camera can combine the IBIS with the optical image stabilizer to give you better results. And I've also tested the lens image stabilizer in photo mode as well. I shot a few hundred photos with me just standing and hand holding the Canon RP without anything to support me at different shutter speed at 10mm focal length, with and without stabilization. And then I look at the image center and see how sharp it is. My test results shows the lens stabilization system give me about 2 to 3 stop improvements in terms of slowest shutter speed that I can shoot at, which is pretty good as I can handheld almost as slow as 1 second and still get a good percentage of photos that are sharp. That has expanded my shooting envelope quite a bit. If you're wondering why it's not 5 stops, well, my test results almost never matches the manufacturer's figure, usually about 2 stops lower than the official figures. So my test results for this Canon lens seems to be quite consistent when I compare it with my previous image stabilization test results. Now, there is one thing I want to point out, which is just like a lot of other ultra wide-angle lenses that I have tested previously, with the image stabilization enabled and when I was shooting at very slow shutter speed, the center of the image is sharp thanks to the stabilization system. However, the corner is very often blurry as the system cannot correct the camera movement effectively at the corner. So if you are shooting landscape photos at slow shutter speed without a tripod, you may find the center of the photo is sharp, but the corner is blurry, so the image is still not really usable. But this is not a unique issue to this Canon lens. It happens with pretty much any ultra wide-angle lens that I have tested previously. It's just a limitation of the stabilization system we have on our cameras these days. This lens uses STM autofocus motor. It is quite interesting because pretty much every single other high-end Canon RF lenses uses USM autofocus motor, which provides very fast autofocus performance. So does that mean this lens has slow autofocus performance? Luckily, the autofocus is also very fast with this lens, even though it uses STM autofocus motor. Autofocus operation is also very quiet, which means this lens is also very suitable for video as well. The minimum focus distance of this lens is 25 cm or just about 10 inches. When I'm shooting at 10mm focal length, the minimum working distance, which is the distance between the front element and the subject, is about 6.5 cm. When I'm shooting at 20mm focal length, the minimum focus distance is about 9 cm. The maximum magnification ratio of 0.12 times is achieved at 20mm focal length. Here are 2 photos shot at the minimum focus distance at 10mm and 20mm focal length. You can see the magnification ratio is indeed a bit higher at 20mm focal length. 0.12 times maximum magnification ratio is alright, but I really wish the minimum focus distance can be a little bit shorter. For example, when I found this little grasshopper in my garden, I really wish that I could get a little bit closer to it to take a bigger photo of this grasshopper. But at least the photo shot at minimum focus distance is quite sharp and good quality. And now let's have a look at the image sharpness, and let's start with 10mm focal length. Let's zoom into the center. At f4, the center is already very sharp, so stopping down the lens doesn't make the center any sharper. The center sharpness remains the same until around f16 when diffraction makes the center becomes softer. If we look at the corner, at f4, the corner is a bit soft. I can still kind of read the small text at the corner, but it's really like me trying to read something that is far away when I'm not wearing my glasses. Stopping down the lens would slowly improve the sharpness and the corner becomes sharpest at f8. However, even at f8, it's still not something I would call very sharp. Focus at the corner of the photo instead of the center would improve the corner sharpness a little bit. This suggests there is a bit of field curvature with this lens at 10mm focal length. And now let's look at the test photos shot at the 30N 20mm focal length. The center is also very sharp already at f4, so stopping down the lens doesn't improve the center sharpness anymore. And now let's have a look at the corner. Even at f4, the corner is already very sharp. Stopping down the lens would only make some very small improvement to the corner, but I don't think anyone will be unhappy about the corner sharpness even if you shoot the photo at f4. At 20mm focal length, focus at the center or focus at the corner doesn't seem to make any difference to the corner sharpness. This suggests that this lens at 20mm focal length doesn't really have much field curvature. While an ultra wide angle lens usually is not a lens that you care too much about bokeh, but since this Canon lens can focus as close as 25cm, we could still dissolve the background a bit when shooting close-up photos. The background bokeh doesn't look too bad. It is pretty smooth, doesn't look nervous, and because the lens has a 9 aperture braid design, so when you stop down the lens slightly, the bokeh still look very round. Okay, we'll talk about vignetting now. These are photos I shot at 10mm focal length. The lens only has very minimal amount of vignetting at f4, and once I stop down the lens to f5.6, then there is virtually no vignetting. At the 30N 20mm is very similar, only a tiny amount of light fall off at the corner at f4, but once I stop down the lens a bit, then I see pretty much no light fall off at all. However, all these photos were created with the lens profile correction applied. If I disable the correction, then we can see some pretty noticeable vignetting. At 20mm, there are some strong vignetting at f4, and I can still see a bit of vignetting even when I stop down the lens. And at 10mm focal length, it is even worse. There is very strong light fall off near the edge. The corner is pretty much black. While stopping down the lens would improve and minimize vignetting, even at f22, there is still a bit of black corner in the photo. So it seems Canon has applied some very strong vignetting correction to minimize the vignetting effect when you enable the lens profile correction, and there's also a bit of cropping as well. I will talk about the cropping a little bit later when I talk about distortion. We look at chromatic aberration now. I would say this Canon lens is excellent in this area. There is really minimal, almost no color fringing in all my photos. I don't think anyone would complain about chromatic aberration when shooting with this lens. Okay, now distortion. Let's look at these 3 photos I shot at 10mm, 15mm and 20mm focal length. There's only a very small amount of distortion. All these 3 photos look really good for such an ultra wide angle lens. However, these are raw photos converted to JPEG using Lightroom with the lens profile correction enabled. If I disable the lens profile correction, if you look at the photo shot at 20mm, there is a bit more distortion, but the difference is pretty small. Photo shot at 15mm focal length, we can see quite a bit of barrel distortion. I think still acceptable. But if you look at the photo shot at 10mm focal length, now there is a huge difference. There is tons of barrel distortion, very noticeable. You can also see the field of view before the distortion correction is quite a bit wider as well. It seems Canon made this lens quite a bit wider than 10mm. Then they apply some big correction and cropping to remove the distortion from the photo shot at 10mm. We have a look at the lens flare performance now. And I think this is one thing that Canon really shows us what one of the best optics company in the world can do when it comes to lens flare control. Look at this test video. When I shoot directly into the sun at the maximum aperture f4, this lens has excellent lens flare control. There is only a very small amount of ghosting, but other than that, it's almost like the sun doesn't exist at all. The contrast remains excellent. Consider this is an ultra wide angle lens with a big front element, and the lens hood doesn't really help much at all when I'm shooting like this. This is easily one of the best lens flare performance that I have ever seen. Sunstars is very important for a lens like this Canon 10-20, as a lot of photographers would use this lens for landscape photos, and for the nighttime landscape photos, the sunstars would make or break a photo. This Canon lens is very interesting because when I shoot at the maximum aperture f4, I can already see sunstars. The lens 9 aperture brace render 18-point sunstars that look quite beautiful. When you stop down the lens more, the sunstars would become sharper and sharper. At f22, the tails of the sunstars are really long and clean. While I personally prefer sunstars that has less number of tails, but it is just my personal preference, and I think the sunstars from this Canon lens is beautiful, especially when you stop down the lens to around f16 or f22. Shooting photo at 10mm focal length at f4, if we zoom in to the corner, I don't see too much of those typical butterfly shaped comma flare. However, the street lights renders as 45-degree oval shape. If I stop down to f5.6, then the oval shape becomes a bit less apparent. For ultra wide angle lenses, focus briefing is usually not a problem, and indeed I don't notice too much focus briefing with this lens. When I did my usual 1 meter to infinity focus briefing test at both 10mm and 20mm focal length, I see very minimal amount of focus briefing. It has been a while since I spent a good amount of time to properly play with a Canon RF lens, and this lens is pretty much exactly what I thought it would be. What I like the most is the size of this lens. This lens is really compact for a f4 zoom lens that can go as wide as 10mm. Build quality is as good as I expected for a Canon L lens. The lens feels very solid and premium. Image quality is fantastic in pretty much every single area when I have the lens profile correction enabled. The only thing that can be improved is the corner performance at 10mm focal length. It is not that sharp even when I stop down the lens. And I believe the reason why the corner is not that sharp at 10mm focal length is in order for Canon to make such a compact zoom lens that can go all the way to 10mm, Canon has to heavily rely on software correction to give us good distortion and vignetting performance. This is one of the biggest difference between a lens for the mirrorless camera and the lens for DSLR camera. With DSLR cameras, users would see exactly how the optics render the image through the optical viewfinder. So if there is big distortion or vignetting, user would see it immediately. But now with mirrorless cameras, the camera has the opportunity to process and correct the image first before showing it to the user through either the EVF or the LCD screen. So pretty much every company now relies on the lens profile correction to improve the image quality through software processing. This means the lens doesn't really have to be optically perfect in every single area, and it gives more freedom to the lens designer to create lenses that are smaller and use software to correct any imperfections. While I personally prefer and more appreciate lenses that have good optics performance, but the final result is really what matters the most. So I don't really have problem with Canon's approach on this lens. A small and lighter lens would really benefit users and makes it more likely for you to carry it with you, so you would use this lens more. But we just need to understand using software correction has its drawbacks, especially when you apply strong distortion and vignetting correction. It would impact the corner image quality, and that's why we don't have very nice and sharp corners when shooting at 10mm with this lens. This is really a design trade-off, and I think it makes sense. So if you love to have a zoom lens that can go crazily wide, this Canon RF10-20 is just a very unique lens that no other systems offers right now. And even if you already have the Canon EF 11-24 f4 lens, it will still be very hard to resist this lens once you find out how much smaller and lighter this lens is.